Welcome back to Spill the TXC with me, your host, Amber. Before we get into today's episode, I need you to sit with a thought for a second. When you think of danger, and I'm talking about real danger, you don't picture a child, do you? You picture somebody older, bigger, somebody obvious. Because somewhere along the way, we've all been taught the same thing. That children are innocent, that whatever goes wrong can be explained. They don't fully understand what they're doing. But what happens when that isn't true? What happens when the person who crosses the line is somebody who hasn't even reached adulthood yet? Today's episode is all about those cases. The ones that don't sit right. The ones that don't have easy answers. The ones that make you question where behaviour really comes from. And whether some lines, once crossed, were ever going to be avoided in the first place. This is Killer Kids. In the summer of 2007, a quiet industrial city in eastern Ukraine became the centre of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in modern European history. Ooh. The city is called Dnipro, but at the time it was still widely known by its former name, and I'm going to attempt this, Dnepropetrovsk. For reasons that you've just witnessed, I'm not going to attempt to say the victims' names here because I feel like I would be doing them such an injustice, so I am going to put them up on the screen so that you know exactly who I'm talking about. What happened in Dnipro, it wasn't driven by money. It wasn't driven by revenge. It wasn't even, in any conventional sense, personal. It was something far more unsettling. Violence for the sake of violence. The perpetrators were two teenagers, and I am going to attempt their names because, really, who gives a crap if I say their names wrong? We've got Viktor Sayenko, and we've got Igor Suprunyuk. Both were 19 years old at the time of their arrest. They weren't outsiders. They weren't drifters. They actually came from relatively stable backgrounds. They had friends, they had families, and they blended in like a normal person. And that's part of what makes this case so difficult to process, because there were no obvious warning signs that could explain what came next. Before the killings, there were a few disturbing behaviours. Accounts later revealed cruelty towards animals, a pattern that, while not universal, is often associated with escalating violent tendencies. But even then, nothing that clearly predicted what could unfold. They weren't loners in the traditional sense. They weren't completely isolated. If anything, they were ordinary. And that's what makes this story linger, because it challenges a question we don't like to ask. How much can we really tell about someone before it's too late? It was June 2007 that the violence began. Victims were attacked in public spaces, often in broad daylight. The weapon most commonly used was a hammer, and there was no clear pattern in the victims themselves. They were chosen at random. Elderly individuals, passerbys, people going about completely normal days. And there was no known connection between the victims and the perpetrators. No shared history, no motive rooted in personal grievance. Just proximity. Just opportunity. Over a span of just a few weeks, the number of victims grew rapidly. And by the time they were caught, investigators linked them to 21 murders. Just let that sink in. 21 lives, taken in less than a month. The attacks were quick, unpredictable, and deeply unsettling for the community. People became afraid to walk alone, afraid to step outside, because there was no type to watch out for. Anyone could be next. One of the most widely discussed and disturbing aspects of this case was the existence of video recordings. The perpetrators filmed at least one of the attacks. This detail spread rapidly once the case became public, earning them international fame. The footage itself is not something I'm willing to describe in detail, but its existence raises a critical point. This wasn't just about violence. It was about documenting it, about revisiting it, about turning it into something repeatable. And this is where the case becomes especially complex, because investigators struggled to establish a clear motive. There was no financial gain, no ideological cause, no personal vendetta. And at times, the explanation given was chillingly simple. They just wanted to see what it felt like. That's it. No deeper justification. And for many people, that's the hardest part to accept, because we rely on motive to make sense of violence. And here, there just isn't one that fits comfortably. They wanted to see what it felt like, again and again and again, times 21 that we know of. Despite the randomness of the attacks, small details began to surface. Witnesses, patterns in movement, and crucially, stolen items. You see, the boys weren't just murderers, they were also thieves. Some victims had belongings taken, including phones. These were later traced. And eventually, investigators closed in. In July 2007, both Sayenko and Sopronyuk were arrested. And then a third individual, Alexander Hanzar. He was charged too, but not with the murders. He was nothing to do with the murders. He was charged with the robberies. He was somehow included in the robberies of the phone and the personal items, but was nothing to do with the murders and didn't know anything about them, somehow. And then the trial began in 2008. It drew significant media attention, not just in Ukraine, but globally. The sheer number of victims, the age of the perpetrators, and the nature of the crimes. All of it contributed to the intensity surrounding the case. The two boys were both convicted, and they received life sentences, which in Ukraine means imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Thank goodness. For the city of Dnipro, the impact didn't just disappear with the arrests. There's a lingering psychological effect that cases like this leave behind. Because again, there was no clear reason, no warning, no way for the victims to have seen it coming. And that creates a kind of fear that's hard to shake. They murdered the elderly, they murdered parents, and they murdered other children. Cases like this challenge the way we understand crime. We often look for patterns, we look for warning signs, and we look for reasons, but sometimes those things don't line up in a way that makes sense. And that's what makes this case so unsettling. Not just what happened, but how little explanation there is for why it happened. There's a moment in certain stories where everything changes. Not because something loud happens, but because something quiet does. A decision, a glance, a step in the wrong direction. And by the time anyone notices, it's already too late. This is one of those stories, and once you hear it, you won't forget it. It was February 1993, a shopping centre in Bootle, which is just outside of Liverpool. It was busy, it was noisy, and it was a completely ordinary day. Families moving through shops, parents distracted, children wandering just a little bit too far ahead. The kind of place where nothing feels dangerous, until it is. On this particular day, there was a 2-year-old boy called James Bulger. He walked slightly ahead of his mother, just slightly. Just far enough, and for just long enough. And in that small gap, 2 other children noticed him. 2 boys, both 10 years old, John Venables and Robert Thompson. And at first, nothing about them stood out. They weren't older teenagers, they weren't intimidating, they were children. And that's what makes this next part so difficult to process. Because there was no obvious threat, no warning, just a moment that passed without anybody realizing what it meant. And what makes this case even more haunting is that parts of it were captured on CCTV. Grainy footage, black and white, easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. It shows 2 boys walking with the toddler, leading him away, just calmly. No rush, no visible struggle, just 3 children walking together like nothing was wrong. And that image, that's the one people still remember because now we know exactly what it meant. At first, it wasn't immediately clear what had happened. A missing child in a crowded place, searches began, and panic spread. But no one imagined the truth. Because the truth didn't make sense. Not with the ages involved. Not with what people believe children are or are not capable of. Eventually the search ended, and poor James was found. And the case shifted instantly from confusion to something much darker. This tiny little boy, he was beaten, he was sexually assaulted, and then he was killed. And what you need to know is this. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. It was calculated. And it was done by children. And what I find so terrifying is Young children, they do look up to older children. They want to be one of the older kids. I know my little girl, she's 4. She loves playing with the older kids, her older cousins. They want to feel older. They want to just, it would have been so easy for these 2 boys to pull James away. They wouldn't have had to pull him. It would have been so easy for them to get him away. Little kids want to be like the big kids. And that's all he would have wanted. When investigators identified the 2 boys responsible, the entire country struggled to process it. 10 years old. 10. At that age, most children are still learning right from wrong, still figuring out empathy, still being guided. So the question became, how does something like this happen? And then as details emerged, people began searching for answers. Backgrounds were examined, upbringings analysed, behaviours picked apart. There were signs of instability, exposure to difficult environments, but nothing that gave a simple answer. Nothing that made people say, of course, that explains it. That's why they did it. Because it didn't. Nothing explained their actions. And maybe that's what made it worse. This trial was unlike anything ever seen before. 2 children sitting in a courtroom facing charges most adults can't comprehend, and eventually, years later, released with new identities. A chance at anonymity, a chance to disappear from the past, and a chance to start again when James Bulger never got that chance. This case didn't just shock people because of what happened. It stayed with them because of how it happened. The quietness of it, the normality of the beginning, the shopping trip, a moment of distraction, a child walking just a few steps too far, and then 2 other children stepping in and changing everything. There's something deeply unsettling about realizing that not every danger announces itself. Sometimes it looks ordinary, sometimes it looks familiar, and sometimes it looks like something you'd never even question. And maybe that's why this story still lingers, because it leaves you with a thought that's hard to shake. It's not fear, it's more of an awareness. That sometimes the moment everything changes is the one no one notices at all. There is a video circulating right now out of East Harlem, and let's be absolutely clear about what this video is about from the very beginning. A 15-year-old girl said no, and that's it. She was asked for her number and she said no. And from that moment, you see a situation unfold where a young girl is being followed, intimidated, and made to feel unsafe simply because she didn't give a boy access to her. You hear her telling him to stop. You see her trying to get away. And instead of that being respected, it escalates aggressively and violently in a way that no one should ever have to experience. And in my opinion, what you're watching there is evil behaviour. Because at the core of it is something deeply disturbing. The belief that he was entitled to her time, to her attention, to her personal information. And when he didn't get his way, he picked her up, body slammed her to the floor, and then stamped on her head. And that's what makes this bigger than just an isolated incident. Because that mindset, it doesn't come from nowhere. And then, as if that wasn't enough, his mother has come out defending him, saying there's more to the story, that he was reacting, that he was provoked, he was bullied. And look, I understand the instinct to protect your child, but there is a line, because protecting your child should never, ever mean excusing harm done to somebody else. There's a difference between love and enabling, because if your child is capable of causing that kind of harm, real love isn't blind defense. Real love is accountability. Real love is stepping in and saying that's not okay. Because if it's not challenged, what happens next? What happens when behavior like that is explained away, justified and minimized, instead of confronted? This is where it becomes a much bigger question. What creates this? Is it something someone is born with? That level of entitlement, that disregard for someone else's boundaries, that evil bone? Or is it learned? Built over time through what's excused, what's tolerated, what's never corrected? Because if someone grows up believing they're always right, that there's always a reason, always a justification, what does that turn into later? But then again, not everyone exposed to the same things makes those choices. So is it environmental? The people they surround themselves with? The influences they absorb every day? Or is there something deeper? Something internal, something that we still don't fully understand? Because that's the question underneath all of this, isn't it? Not just in this case, but every case. What makes somebody cross that line? And more importantly, what could have stopped them? And so I want to leave this with you. What do you think creates this? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Or are we just born with the evil bone? Let me know what you think in the comments. And on that note, I will see you next week for a new episode. I love you. Bye.